Hey guys, my name's Peter,
My name's Tanner.
and this is the Decryption Podcast.
So in today's episode, we're just gonna kind of pick up where we left off from part one. At the end of part one, we started to talk a little bit about controlled demolitions and how we think how Twin Towers fell. It looks like it could have been a controlled demolition. So we're just gonna kind of get into what controlled demolitions really are and what they really look like.
And it's my expert opinion. As a demolition expert, I was trained by the best the U.S. government has. I served 3 years on Underwater Demolition Team 12. 2 years I was attached to SEAL Team 1. And when I look at the buildings and how they fall and the way they fell, they couldn't have come down without being assisted in some manner.
The only way that a building can accelerate as it collapses is by having pre-engineered, precisely timed, and precisely placed explosives. In other words, controlled demolition.
The collapse of the building was caused by controlled demolition.
In fact, the evidence shows very strongly that there were explosives used in the way the buildings came down.
We started running floor by floor, started popping out.
It was like if they had detonated.
Yeah,
If
detonated,
they were planned to
yeah.
take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
Explosives are used to demolish buildings like this in just seconds. Okay, so it's a controlled demolition. What's the problem with that? Let's just think about this. Controlled demolitions cannot be engineered and rigged in a day. It takes months. And therefore, this event must have been planned in advance.
There are 118 documented testimonies of explosions heard from firemen and other first responders alone. And what's crazy about that is that took a court order to even be released. And that 118 does not include maintenance workers or tower workers.
So after analyzing the locations and the timestamps, the author of our source has further broken down the explosives into 3 categories, and they are impact synchronized booms, pre-collapsed pops, and final booms and crackle.
Impact synchronized booms are explosions seemingly timed with the plane strike in seconds before and after the collision. Pre-collapse pops are explosions heard all over the building from the time of the first plane impact to when Building 7 fell. And the final booms and crackle as the main body of explosives that detonated over the span of a few seconds leading up to and through the collapse.
First, let's take a deeper and a closer look at the impact synchronized booms. So, explosives went off in different parts of the World Trade Center when the plane hit.
William Rodriguez, a 20-year maintenance worker there, said, quote, "It was a huge explosion that came under my feet, meaning it came from the sublevels of B2 and B3, which is the basement. And then there was a huge explosion at the top of the building. You could hear the difference from the bottom to the top."
And another citizen that was drinking coffee at the World Trade Center also said that whenever the first plane had hit, it had felt like a subway collision. But then afterwards, it felt like there were bombs going off.
There's also a video of a first responder saying, quote, "They just found a bomb in a subway tunnel." A citizen who was in the basement said, quote, "All of a sudden the elevator blew up," end quote, and he even had to drag a guy out.
William Rodriguez, a 20-year maintenance employee of the Trade Center who was decorated for saving many people that day, was in the building when the first plane hit. Let's hear what he and a few others had to say about a subterranean explosion coinciding with the first plane hit.
It was a huge explosion that came from under my feet, meaning that it came from the sub-levels between B2 and B3. And then there was a huge explosion at the top of the building. You could hear the difference from the bottom and all the way through the top.
They were having coffee in the World Trade Center when the first plane struck.
And all of a sudden it sounded like, I don't know where the subway is, but it sounded like a subway collision, a bomb.
Just got out of the tunnel and it blew.
The subway tunnel?
Yeah.
Yes, I was right there. I was down in the basement, came down, all of a sudden the elevator blew up, smoke. I dragged the guy out, his skin was hanging off, and I dragged him out, and I helped him out to the ambulance.
Now to me, these stories sound like testimony that there is proof of an explosion.
Whenever the firefighters responded to their first call about a plane hitting the World Trade Centers, which by the way was on the 97th floor, they went there and realized that the first floor was already damaged and more damaged than the floors above it. And how could that be?
Fireman John Schrader, who was there just 10 minutes after the first plane hit, said, quote, "It looked like a bomb went off in the lobby. It wasn't from the jet fuel, no way." One citizen who escaped the lobby says, quote, "The bomb hit the lobby first, and then in a couple of seconds, the first plane hit."
Remember that this entire building is made of reinforced steel. So how is it that another citizen quoted that they saw people die in the basement and lose their legs in the basement, and that a couple people actually had to have reconstructive surgery on their face due to the walls hitting them and smacking them, which, like I said, this building is made of steel. So how is it that all of this is happening in the basement?
An ABC News reporter said, quote, "At the time, I was actually in the subway heading toward the World Trade Center, right around Franklin Street, and after the first explosion, the subway station started to fill with smoke. The subway cars also started to fill with smoke, and the subways actually stopped."
News reporter Jack Kelly of USA Today and Rick Sanchez of CNN said that the explosions could have came from a van parked within the building at ground level, which is wild.
Pat Dawson of NBC News said, quote, "I spoke to the chief of safety for the New York Fire Department. He received word of the possibility of a second device, that is another bomb going off. There was another explosion that took place. According to his theory, there were actually devices that were planted in the building."
Jenny Carr was recording a business meeting on 9/11 at 8:46 a.m. and on her recording, you can hear the basement explosions first, followed within a few seconds by the airplane explosions above.
Another citizen said, quote, "I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building, then another plane hit the other building."
Why did so many people hear an explosion below ground? A collision above might crack or break some windows, but I didn't understand how that could tear up the lobby, especially when you consider the base of the building would have felt the least amount of vibration as the shock wave was absorbed by the 95 floors above it. Remember, these images are from before the second plane strike, meaning these images were recorded between 8:46 and 9:03 a.m. The only thing that had happened so far is a plane impact around the 95th floor of this building.
Right away, a guy from the Port Authority told him the damage was somewhere above the 78th floor. But all you had to do was look around. It was obvious. Something had happened right there in the lobby.
FDNY fireman John Schrader, whose engine company 10 is across the street from the Trade Center complex, arrived at the first tower hit, the North Tower, within 10 minutes of the impact.
We came down, it looked like a bomb went off in the lobby. You know, something, it wasn't from the jet fuel. No way.
The ladies that are with me were in the World Trade Center in the first building and escaped through the lobby where they report they believe there was a bomb in the lobby.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
I mean, I know of people that got killed in the basement. I know of people that got broken legs in the basement. People that got reconstructive surgery because the walls hit them in the face.
At the time, I was actually in the subway heading towards the World Trade Center right around Franklin Street. And after the first explosion, the subway station started to fill with smoke. The subway cars started to fill with smoke, and the subways actually stopped.
With so many people talking about the explosions at street level, it would make sense that early reports had the FBI and others looking into bombs at the base of the buildings.
Apparently what appears to happen was that at the same time two planes hit the building, that the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Reason to believe that one of the explosions at the World Trade Center may have been caused by a van that was parked in the building that may have had some type of explosive device in it.
I spoke to the chief of safety for the New York City Fire Department. He received word of the possibility of a secondary device, that is another bomb going off. There was another explosion which took place. According to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
Jenny Carr was recording a business meeting near the Trade Center at 8:46 a.m. on 9/11 when we hear the basement explosion. 9 seconds later, we can hear the first plane hitting the North Tower.
crash? I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building. Then another plane hit the other building.
So it was clear something had happened to the lobby at the very beginning of the very first attack. But how is this possible, considering the plane made impact at such a high altitude? And why did explosions go off before the plane crashed?
Now, let's talk about pre-collapsed pops. Hundreds of secondary explosions were reported at various times prior to the collapse of all three buildings. There were even more first-hand testimonies for the pre-collapsed pops.
A reporter on CNN said, quote, "We've heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impact." Another citizen said, quote, "Somebody saw an airliner go into one of those towers. Then I felt an hour later we had that big explosion from much, much lower."
There are even videos of secondary explosions going off while the fire department was right there at ground level.
We've heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impact.
Then somebody said that they saw an airliner go into one of those towers. Then, an hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that. Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
Usually, during a controlled demolition, around the end and the final seconds, you will be able to hear the final booms and crackling.
There are even more reports of people hearing explosions as the towers were falling. There's even some videos of explosions happening on lower levels than what had been destroyed at this time, which would be impossible, as the building would have to crumble floor by floor from the top down.
That feeling that there was something else, that there may have been something else that brought those buildings down.
There was a lot of talk there in New York of another explosion prior to the collapse of the first building.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
In this footage, which has been slowed, you can see white smoke emanating from the ground floor before the collapse wave arrives. It's an unsteady camera, but keep in mind whoever recorded this was running for their life. It was like watching a stunt car explode before it crashes at the bottom of the cliff. In this image, recently released by a Freedom of Information Act request, police department photographer captured an explosion originating at the base of the South Tower, just before the first tower collapsed. The explosions and shockwave before Building 7's collapse were captured in different ways.
We're watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out.
Even after all of that evidence, it was still denied and ignored in official versions by the NIST, FEMA, Popular Mechanics, and the 9/11 Commission.
Another example to look for in a controlled demolition is the kink in the roof. When a building falls, you don't always see a kink in the roof. However, when you do see a kink in the roof, it is almost always an indication of a controlled demolition.
The roof could only kink in if the support columns are blown out. That is because the destruction is coming from within, and they do that in controlled demolitions to make sure that all the damage goes within its own footprint instead of going outwards. And the kink on Building 7 is very obvious.
Controlled demolitions are also designed to let the top floor fall through its support columns. You can see the top penthouse of Building 7 come down first, right before the rest of the building comes down. Squibs are more pieces of visible evidence of a controlled demolition. Squibs are explosives that go off at the wrong time. For example, controlled demolitions are from the top down, meaning the explosives would be blowing up one floor at a time at a very fast rate from the top floor going down. However, it is common to see explosives on the middle floor detonate while the explosives at the top floor have just started. This is usually the result of a bomb malfunction or human error.
Squibs were actually recorded for all three buildings. From the timing the first plane hit to the collapsing of the last tower. They go unnoticed until you start paying attention. There are actually multiple still photos that show evidence of a squib. The official report addressed this as compressed air caused by pancaking floors. If it were compressed air, it should have found the path of least resistance. It shouldn't have burst out windows on the lower levels. There were windows being blown out about 40 levels below the initial blast wave.
There were explosives that went off on the first tower at the exact same time the second tower was hit. These videos might be the most apparent evidence yet.
Squibs are the sixth indicator on our list. In demolition vernacular, squibs refer to visible blasts from explosive charges. Often they are visible through mistiming or malfunction in some way. Usually they are hidden in the debris cloud. In simple terms, squibs are visual evidence of explosives. Squibs were recorded from the moment of the first plane impact through the collapse of the last tower. For me, they went unnoticed until I looked at the video more closely. These stills captured squibs as the towers collapsed. The official version stated these squibs were compressed air caused by the pancaking floors, which squeezed air to the point of bursting out a window. The seal of the building was already broken when the collapse began. Logically, if it was compressed air, it should have found the path of least resistance through the broken part of the building. It shouldn't have knocked out a window here or a window there, as many as 40 floors below the blast wave.
Naysayers tend to say, well, that's just air being blown out the windows. I mean, it doesn't really work to say it's just air pressure. And I've estimated these are coming out faster than 100 miles an hour.
The following clips show multiple squibs popping out, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes dozens of floors away from each other. Of all the 9/11 information I've come across, this may have been the easiest to spot. Yet it provided me with one of those stark moments in which the reality of 9/11 sunk in to a new level. In this clip, notice how the squib occurs before the floors above reach the blast ejection point. Not all squibs, however, were easy to spot. Remember how we discussed explosions that were timed to go off with the plane impacts? Well, this is the first plane impact. Notice the dark brown smoke coming out of the top floor of the tower. This smoke is already dissipating before the plane strikes the building. In this segment, the NBC camera is pointed at the north tower. The first tower hit. In a few seconds, the second tower is going to be hit. You'll know it when it happens because of the reporter's voice and the fireball in the lower left corner of the screen. Now keep your eye on the east facade, the one on the left. Notice how several tiny explosions go off as the second plane hits the other building, perhaps in an effort to mask some necessary work prior to its demolition, as I was thinking at the time.
Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit.
The next example of this being a controlled demolition is called a demolition wave. This video summarizes it perfectly.
The seventh characteristic of a planned implosion is what's called a demolition wave. It's the path of destruction in a controlled demolition. It is a visible wave of explosions moving down the columns of a building just ahead of or at the speed of gravity. This array of synchronized explosives is timed to blow out floors beneath the collapse wave as the floors above reach the floors below, thus allowing a drop at approaching freefall speed. Again, let's slow down the film for some of these. When slowed down, you can see how the explosions are timed to go off, floor by floor. In this clip, you can clearly see a demolition wave proceeding down a column mostly hidden by the umbrella of the falling debris pile. Look to the right of the black line. It's a bit grainy because of the zoom. Here it is again without the black line. You can see synced explosives cutting a path down the building. The demolition wave can be hard to see with an untrained eye because it happens so fast. I've tried to highlight a few more examples in the following clips.
Another example of controlled demolition explosions is the projectiles. The blast from the explosions will send objects barreling outside of the building's footprint. During 9/11, a lot of pieces of steel were shot way too far out than they could have been if it were a gravitational collapse.
Some of these pieces were ejected hundreds of feet. Some of these pieces also weighed a few tons. For example, multi-ton steel beams were found nearly 2 football fields away from the building. There are also objects on video that were shot upward. Once again, if this was a gravitational collapse, how is something getting shot upward?
There are several experts on this topic that believe that only explosives could cause such a major force.
Window mullions and things went up and out. That kind of stuff can't happen with just pure air pressure of floors getting sandwiched together.
Large multi-ton beams were hurled hundreds of yards laterally. Gravity works vertically, not laterally.
The fragments which are being, which is coming out of the tower, obviously being kicked out by an explosive action.
And here it is trailing white smoke the whole time. It really is indicative of some kind of explosion.
I'm no physicist, but if this was a gravitational collapse, there is no way that multi-ton beams can land 2 football fields away. I've lived in high-rises my whole life, and I've dropped things off my balcony, things like shoes and computer monitors. All they do is fall straight down. Even aerodynamic items like plates never ended up across the street. In some of these clips, you can see projectiles actually propelled upward, forming an arc. If this were a gravitational collapse, pieces could not be shot upward. And consider the pieces we see. The small pieces weigh a few pounds and the biggest pieces weigh several tons. In this clip, a multi-ton steel box column had so much lateral force that it pierced the building across the street. To give you an idea of its size, here you can see a construction worker standing at the base of the box column being installed. If I can't chuck a shoe more than 150 feet from the 50th floor of my building, how much force do you need to get a multi-ton steel girder to triple that? I could pretty much rule out a gravitational or progressive collapse with the physical dynamics I'd seen with my own eyes. And I found it ironic that the only part left standing was the base of the building. Even though the whole building landed on it, it was the only part of the building whose columns did not become dismembered. Perhaps that says something about the difficulty in wiring the atrium of the towers. And maybe these columns at the base did what the rest of the building should have done, and that is stay together in some way. Just a personal observation I'd made at the time.
So with that being said, we're going to conclude our video as to why we think that 9/11 could have been caused by controlled demolitions and explosives. Hopefully you enjoyed what we had to say, and we wanted to let you know that we're actually going to be having a part 3. So don't think that this is it. There's actually still a couple more things that you need to tune into and be brought to light. So just stick around.
Cool. And if there's only one question you guys can ask yourselves, it is, why is it that all the things you look for in a controlled demolition, everything that we've just shown you, all checks out for the falling of the Twin Towers? So just some food for thought. Why do they all, maybe if one of them checks out, but why do they all check out? I don't know. But yeah, with that being said, yeah, this will conclude our video. So my name's Tanner.
My name is Peter, and this is the Decryption Podcast. Peace.